The Influence Continuum.
This is a podcast all about influence, not just destructive influence like the ones we see in cults, but also the ethical, healthy side of influence. Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I'm very, very excited to talk with Daniel Barban Levin, about his incredible memoir called Slonim Woods 9, which I just listened on Audible to. And whoever read it, I was disappointed at first that you hadn't read it, but then whoever did it did great voices of all the different characters. So I think, you know, anyone who likes listening to books, that it will be incredible. And of course, you are a poet, and I have to, tell my listeners who may not know my backstory, but I was a poetry major at Queens College in 1974. And when I was sucked into the Moonies as a sign of my obedience, I threw out all of my poetry because I was ordered to. So man, as I'm listening to your poetic prose of your memoir, it's just getting my neurons bouncing, going, you miss that voice, that creative voice, because so much of what I've been doing, Dan, has been nonfiction and heavy stuff like psychology and all of that. I just want to say a few more things. You hold an MFA from the University of California, Irvine. You're a winner of all kinds of prizes and fellowships and incredible accolades, and you deserve them. You're currently living in Los Angeles. I believe you'll be teaching a course affiliated with Stanford University about turning your stories into memoirs that can also help educate people about cults and mind control. And before we start, I'll just add one more thing, that I was asked to look at a Hulu series on Larry Ray cult of Sarah Lawrence fame. And in fact, he was convicted of trafficking. So there'll be a lot more information out about this horrible cult. And I looked at the video first, the documentary first, which had a lot of intense, real videos of abuse. And it was remarkable. And I have to be honest, as an empathetic person, as a therapist, it was so hard to watch at times because I wanted to get up and punch him in the face, or call the SWAT team, like, help these people. But of course, I knew you were out already, and the nightmare was over. But nevertheless, it was hard to watch. But it's going to be a very powerful case study, I think, for anyone who wants to understand how mind control and my bite model of authoritarian control is used. So forgive me for being long-winded, Dan, but your book was amazing. And I really think anyone who's ever been in a mind control group or relationship will be able to listen to your book or read it and identify with so many key things. And with that, I will invite you to please share what you would like to with our listeners.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your kind words about the book. I think what I hoped to achieve with that book was to walk people through the experience of being compelled by a powerful personality, and to make the experience, to make myself relatable and legible. I wanted people who have trouble imagining themselves in the experience of someone being drawn into a cult, surviving through and inside a cult. People who find it difficult to imagine themselves in that position, to see how not that distant it is from your normal day-to-day experience, how it's not as if a switch flips and someone just suddenly becomes a cult victim, that in fact throughout it you're a quote-unquote normal human being attempting to survive the same way that people are attempting to survive all kinds of situations, and we bring to bear our coping mechanisms for normalization, for all kinds of tools that we use to get through trauma.
Right. So I don't want to assume my listeners know about the Lawrence Ray, Sarah Lawrence cult. Mm-hmm. So could you please set the table for my listeners? What are we talking about? What year was it? What walk us through the beginnings of this nightmare.
Yeah, so I went to Sarah Lawrence College in 2009. I moved into a dorm in my sophomore year with a bunch of my friends. One of the people who lived in that dorm, more of kind of a house, was Talia Ray, just dating one of my closest friends. And she told us one day that her dad, who we had been hearing about for a long time from her, he was supposedly an ex-Marine. He was sort of a hero. He had done all these amazing things. He had worked for various intelligence agencies. And he had been sort of at the center of this conspiracy. This is all according to his daughter, Talia. He had been put in prison unjustly, and he was getting out. And they had been separated for all these years. Would we mind if he just stayed over in our dorm for a little while he sort of got his feet back under him? All the rest of us, 19 years old at Sarah Lawrence College, were not going to say no. And honestly, I can say for myself, just didn't really care that much, if I'm just being honest. And so this guy, Lawrence Ray, Talia's dad, showed up. And I think it's probably fair to say that with this type of personality, this, what would later become clear to me was a narcissist, a megalomaniac, all of these things. Once they get their foot in the door, it's pretty hard to get them out. So once he was there, he didn't leave. He sort of took over the whole environment, the social group. He slowly started to suck my friends in one by offering his help, his, quote unquote, his help, his support, his kind of version of therapy. He was buying everyone food. He was love bombing. He was doing all of the things. Where this evolved to is he got access to an apartment in Manhattan. That summer, I moved into that apartment where all of my friends were living. I can go into more depth.
So let me just add, if I may. So you're in a living arrangement at school with 8 students. You're funky. You're 19. People are having sex with each other and smoking a doobie here or there, and it's very normal, kid stuff. And you're all figuring out your identities. And here comes this older male, person who claimed to have these profound, deep insights into human nature, and he could fix everybody. He was very braggadocio. He claimed to know Gorbachev, and he was the best man of Bernie Kerik, who was a real person who was pardoned by Trump, I might add, a real person. But there was this imbalance of power immediately by his age. But because he was the father of one of your dorm mates, the alarm bells weren't normally ringing. Whereas if somebody met you on the street and said, "Let me move in with you," you would have been like, "Get lost." Is
Yeah,
that right?
and it
Is
just
that right?
turned out that that's right. The way that he operated was by leveraging credibility, right? So he leveraged the credibility of his daughter, who we had no reason not to trust, in order to get in the door. And that's how he had operated for decades and decades. So this is part of what was so disorienting and made it very difficult to form an understanding of what was going on. One of many things was that when he said that he had a relationship with Gorbachev or he had a relationship with George H.W. Bush or these things, I would doubt that. And then later he would show me a photo of himself with Gorbachev, this sort of thing. So he had managed to worm his way into rooms that other people wouldn't find themselves in, and
Yeah.
then to kind of manipulate the story around why he was there, what he was doing with this or that person, to create an entirely different narrative later on.
And he was proposing himself as this great counselor who could help resolve unresolved childhood trauma or identity issues,
Mm-hmm.
and you just needed to accept that his certainty would be more weighted than your own
Mm-hmm.
conscience or your own critical faculties. And he
Yeah.
used a lot of mind control techniques. I could go through my bite model and we could watch the documentary, go through your book, and literally, oh, here he's controlling information by deceiving. Here he's compartmentalizing information by telling one person one thing and another thing to someone else, or he's gathering information on another potential victim by eliciting it. And needless to say, he was having sex with co-eds, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And later, because he's going to jail, he was trafficking one woman to the tune of $1 million, is my
Mm-hmm.
understanding,
Yeah,
which
that's
was
right.
horrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, things escalated right beyond. Once we moved into that apartment in Manhattan, I had sort of resisted his orbit at Sarah Lawrence, um, but I agreed to sit down for a conversation with him. And I think that anyone, well, I don't. I would be curious for sort of your take on the initial conversation with a cult leader. But I think I experienced what seems to me a pretty classic model of the kind of a lot of love bombing, a lot of telling me how special I was, how capable I
Exactly.
was, even kind of comparing me to my friends, um, and sort of doing some cold reading, seeming to have some deep insight into my background, my experiences. And we sat in a Starbucks talking for, I think the reality is probably around somewhere between 6 and 9 hours. I really don't know how long that conversation was. But we closed out the Starbucks. I sort of didn't feel the time passing. We talked about, my mom being sick my whole life, about my insecurities, about my body, about sex and sexuality, relationships, about the relationship I was in at the time, which I think was part of,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
what created a vulnerability for me because I was in this difficult situation at the end of my first serious relationship.
Yep.
And then when we finally walked out of that Starbucks and he really had full control over what happened and when, and we walked down the street and around the corner, and there was a limousine waiting there, and the door opened, and all of my friends were sitting inside, and it became clear. I sort of only realized this later that they had been sitting waiting in this idling limousine the entire 6 or so hours. And
Mm.
I knew this because later I would experience a lot of sitting and waiting in cars for hours,
Mm-hmm.
not sure what to do while waiting for Larry Ray. So he really had full control from the
Yeah,
beginning.
and when you're a cult leader, you want to have total obedience, and part of it is, rewarding good behaviors when the people lift you up and do what you tell them to do. and punishing them verbally, emotionally, and even physically. The amount of physical abuse that later took place was just horrifying to me, for my listeners to watch and to hear about and such. But you got away. You went away to college in England even, and I was like, yes, he got away. And then it was oh, I feel guilty. I haven't contacted Larry. What am I going to say? What excuse can I use? And it reminded me a bit of my early Mooney experience, because I got away from the first workshop, got home, but I was so confused and wondering, is this my path? Should I go back? But in other words, the ideas were implanted at that point. And he was giving, like a fisherman gives a fish line and then reels it back in. That was, right. So you reached out and he got you back in again. But you left. I mean, you got out before a lot of your friends did. So help my listeners understand some of the things that contributed to your realization this is not your path. This is not where you want to be.
Yeah, so I think that what the experience you're describing in England of me kind of getting all of this space and yet still feeling a bit trapped, or this kind of pull back towards my abuser, it speaks to the central challenge that I was going through the whole time, which was just not trusting my own feelings about what was going on. And I had been pretty trained to understand any feeling I had of discomfort as something was wrong with me, with my mind, my attitude. I needed to sort of get with the program. Everyone else seemed to be doing great. They seemed to really be learning from all of these things. So something must have been wrong with me. And why did I feel both this kind of relief being thousands of miles away in England, but also this deep dread and panic? And so I, instead of seeing that as because of the trauma, I saw it as clearly something's still wrong. And do I want to live the rest of my life this way? When I got back from England, after connecting with Larry, and he was suddenly being so much warmer and kind of gracious, and it just felt like I couldn't get away. Once I was back in that apartment, he really turned up the intensity on the abuse in a way that in retrospect felt like he was testing the boundaries of what he could get away with, it seems like. And I was kind of an early test subject for that. I mean, everyone else was also experiencing various forms of abuse, but as I think is fairly typical, there was a kind of hierarchy, and there always needed to be someone on the bottom who was sort of the scapegoat, and that would rotate, and it created this power dynamic where you were just desperate not to be the person being abused. You would do anything, including turn in your friends for something you didn't even believe happened, just so that you could not be the person getting hurt. And so the abuse that he enacted on me became more and more extreme. There was he was torturing me in front of my friends. Any amount of the kind of shining a light on me had gone away, so there wasn't the positive side that kind of makes you feel like, oh, I understand why I'm here. And it just was so horrible that at a certain point, I mean, I reached a point where I considered killing myself. And I think that felt like this line where part of the Larry Ray cult that we haven't talked about was his insistence that all of us were suicidal, and that's what he was protecting us from. That if we left him, we would kill ourselves with sort of impulsively. And I found that I felt as if I didn't want to live because of him. And as I sort of faced that decision, it no longer became about intellectually figuring out, is Larry a good guy or a bad guy? Is what he's doing actually helping me or hurting me? Like trying to answer all of these questions. And instead I just was like, this feels terrible. I just feel that I need to leave. And it became about having feelings. And Larry was all about logic. And I just sort of let myself feel this and went with it and left. And then once I was away, I just kept feeling that feeling. And here we are.
So let me just say for our listeners and for those who will eventually watch the Hulu series, hopefully, he really was a gaslighter extreme. So if I may just share that he would tell you that you broke his expensive pots, but you don't remember having hurt his pots, but he has convinced you there's a part of you that you're not in touch with that is doing all this malevolent stuff. So in other words, he got inside your head and co-opted your reality testing mechanisms that every healthy person needs to be, no, I'm not a person who takes people's pots and scratches them on purpose. Like, just, I know myself, I would never do it. And if I did do it, I would apologize and I would make it right. But you had no memory of doing it. And yet he was just hammering you over and over again. And part of what mind controllers do, if I may say, is they want to co-opt your doubts. And what comes to mind at the moment is a very famous Rajneesh line. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later, after he died, was called Osho, horrible cult leader, sex fanatic also, I might add, and drug user. But he said something, I'm going to try to do his voice if I may. I'm not Indian, so forgive me if I butcher it. But something like, if you have a doubt, it is because I put it in your minds so that you could leave and then realize that you must come back and submit yourself to me. I'm sorry I butchered it.
No, that's fine.
But the trick,
your doubt.
The trick is, it's not your doubts anymore, it's his doubts. He did it to you to teach you a lesson, and the lesson is come back and surrender your will and your mind and your heart. Right.
And so just to be, I can, explain sort of the function of control that you're talking about with the supposed breaking of things. Yeah. So the way that Larry operated at a certain point, I think that what he did first was kind of sever our relationship with our long-term memory, right? So it seems maybe a little bit easier to foment doubts about what might have happened in your early childhood and sort of places where memory is very blurry. And this just introduces the idea that it's possible for you to not know what happened to you, right? And then you add on top of that at a certain point, because we're living in his apartment, he cultivates this feeling that we owe him, right? That he's taking care of us and doing all these nice things, and he's making or buying all our meals, and we're living there for free. And so we start sort of doing work for him, right? And then at a certain point, you're sleeping on average 2 to, if you're lucky, 4 hours a night, maybe, right? So you're already pretty fuzzy.
Well, I was a 3 to 4 hour a nighter as a Moonie, so I can totally relate to that one.
There you go.
You're not thinking clearly when you're on that little sleep. No one is.
No, not at all. And it does make you very open to a kind of dependence, right? If someone's taking care of you in all of these ways and you're just exhausted, and the biggest reward they can give you is sleep at a certain point. Just all you want is relief, right? And so you take all of those circumstances and you ask someone, you point to a scratch on a supposedly $1,000 pan and you say, someone did this and this other person said that you did it. And I know that you did it. And this entire power structure is based on the idea that Larry, who's saying I did it, is correct about everything. So to question this one moment is to question everything. There's so much pressure, and it's so much easier to just say, maybe I did. And then you're seeing everyone else also admit to things like this, right? So you think that maybe memory doesn't work the way that you think it does. And maybe we are sort of missing things, or maybe we do have a desire to sabotage him because he's helping us, which is what he said. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the thing is that there's no way you or anyone could win in a power struggle with someone who is a malignant narcissist who knows about mind control techniques and hypnosis, etc. The only choice is to exit. And I'm an expert, and I'm telling you that I know my limits. I mean, humility is a very important thing to have when you're going in life, because your mind can get hacked, and it can get hacked by very sophisticated people through the internet and other ways. And that's why you really want to have friends and family that you trust, who you can reality test with. And why I did this TEDx talk, Dan, about how can I know if I'm brainwashed. Step one is get away from the environment and the person. Like, turn off your phone, stop doing the practices, just like sleep, eat, dance, listen to music, walk in the woods, write poetry, and then learn about mind control paradigms. What helped me in the get out of the Moonies was the Chinese communist paradigm that Robert J. Lifton wrote about in his 1961 book. But then seek out critics and ex-members. And critics of cults are people like us who are former members. We have our graduate degree in mind control because we survived it, and we've done our homework and processed it and are able to articulate, like, how did this happen? We're intelligent, educated people from good families, right? And go back in time once you have that knowledge, once you have the critical information. And by the way, I almost always, when families call me for help, I almost always recommend hiring a private investigator to do a profile on the suspected predator, because they're typically serial predators and they have a criminal past, and we can find former victims and find out their MOs, right? But the point is once you have that information, then you go back to your first meeting and say, if I knew then what I know now, would I have ever gotten involved? And if the answer is no, then it's time to leave. Like, that's the easy formula that I've come up with now. It's only 47 years of helping people get out of cults, but you really can reduce, some of the critical elements. But I'll just add, what's so hard nowadays is the smartphone is a mind control device, and mind controllers can text you, know your location, put malware on it. So this whole smartphone social media thing needs to be, really understood as a great tool for good things, but also a horrible tool for enslaving large amounts of people.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I would say on the side of the potential positive of social media and these things is, if it works as a tool to make these experiences more visible, which is what I'm hoping to be a part of, that seems
You've written a great book, and
Thank you.
Your book led to this Hulu docuseries. So there's no, really, I'm saluting you. Thank you for your courage and for speaking up.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, part of where I was at when I think it's important to know that when I started writing the book, none of my friends were out of the cult, right? So when I say I wanted to make myself more legible or my experience more relatable, I really had a narrow audience, which was this group of people who I hadn't been able to talk to for years. But while we were in the experience, I couldn't look to my friend and say, like, is this seem weird to you? Or did you actually do that thing that you said you did? Right. So there was a desire to just make this account, and maybe they would read it, and maybe the whole time they had been privately wondering these things, and just to see one person say it might sort of crack something open. Of course, then in the process, while I was writing the book, an FBI investigation started as a result of the reporting that happened in the very beginning. I'm kind of going.
Was that the New York Magazine piece? Or?
Yes. So there was a New York Magazine article that came out that I was a part of that reporting. Then I wrote this book, and then the investigation.
Yeah, you're a whistleblower, dude.
yeah, I guess
seriously.
So. Yeah.
You know, welcome.
Thank you.
To the tribe of people who have survived and come out the other end sane and healthier.
And I want to say there's a dramatic difference for me between there was the period of time when I left and I wasn't talking about what had happened. Right. Yeah, I told my parents, I told my girlfriend. I was talking about it in therapy, but not in a way that I think was really producing results. And from there to being more public about it, having sort of embracing what had happened a little bit more fully. Sure. It's made an enormous difference for my mental health and for my feeling of being here, being present, and not. Yep. So there was a sort of gulf between me and other people as long as I lived with this as a secret. Yeah. And it's scary to cross that gulf, but so incredibly worthwhile.
It's very therapeutic to write your story. I know Jarrett Bullion and Karen Presley, former Scientology, was teaching a course for ex-members to write their story. It's a version of narrative therapy where you're putting on paper, because then you have perspective on the younger you. And you can try to, put things in chronological order, and things that didn't make sense, that were kind of bubbling around or swirling around, start to, make more sense and such. So I definitely want to mention I Got Out and IGotOut.org. And we're really wanting to destigmatize for the millions of people who are still in the cult of Trump. Plug for my book, but also it is what it is. The people who believe in QAnon and think that every person who opposes the GOP is a trafficker of little kids and killing babies or whatever crazy stuff. We want to normalize and say, look, we were there. It's not you. You were subjected to a systematic social influence program that co-opted your critical abilities, that disconnected your own common sense, that alienated you from family and friends, and from sources of how to determine what's true versus just believing blindly because someone has certainty, saying, I know that you scratched that pen. You have to get in touch with the part of you that did it, because that part's going to kill you, Daniel. And what you want to do is put your third finger up and take the pen and hit him in the head. Really, that's what I felt like doing multiple times. Ugh. And I'm so glad he's going to jail as a trafficker. Just so glad.
Yeah, it's we're talking right now about 2 weeks away from, a little less than 2 weeks away from his sentencing. So we'll see what comes of that, but he's looking at a 15-year minimum. But yeah, what you said, one of the things I'm so interested in and challenged by. And one of the things that I learned from this experience, I suppose, is just how tenuous our grasp on what is real and what is true is. And I think that a lot of people, because that's so destabilizing to embrace that idea, that I think it really scares people. And that's part of what creates this gap between, the folks who are watching like true crime and all these things, these cult documentaries,
Yep.
and they say, I would never do that. I would never fall for that.
I would have said that if it hadn't happened to me, Dan.
Yeah, me too.
What's wrong with those people? They're stupid. They're weak. They're, they have no smarts. I was an extra honor student. I know you were too.
Totally.
It's like, but the thing is we're human beings and we don't know it all. And anyone who says they know it all, you should have warning bells. And the burden of proof is on them to prove it, not on us to disprove it. Somebody says that they have the secret to reality. How come you haven't written books and published academic journal articles? Don't show me a photoshopped picture of you and Gorbachev and tell me that you saved the world from the Soviet Union. My former cult leaders claimed he ended the Soviet Union personally. Sun Myung Moon. I bet you didn't know that. But the members believe it. Nobody else does. But then when you think about Trump, Pompeo, Pence, Esper speaking for the Moonies after January 6th, saying how great it is, and the Washington Times, their newspaper, saying it was Antifa attacking the Capitol, you go, what the hell's going on here? Who cares about democracy and civil rights and human rights and rule of law and things like that? But
I think
go ahead.
It seems like just one of the challenges that I found in getting out of a situation like this is that, of course, from the outside, you look at all of these things and it feels like rationally none of it makes sense. But it is incredible once you're within that kind of warped zone, how so much can be rationalized. Like just based on a false premise, you can come to all kinds of wild conclusions. So it becomes really hard to know how to, you have experience talking to, people who are being deprogrammed in a way that I don't, but I imagine it's got to be nearly impossible to try to reason someone's way out of something like this. I just don't know how you get to a place. For me, it was trying to finally kind of just trust myself, my gut kind of, and just that I felt like I bad and a survival instinct just said get away. But it was the trying to reason my way through it. I just wanted an answer, is this right or wrong? And I couldn't answer that question.
Right. So what I learned, and really it was important for me to learn about the military intelligence research of the Chinese communists of the 50s, because Lifton wrote out 8 criteria that you can know environment is brainwashing. And in my deprogramming with the ex-Moonies, we went through all 8. And the Moonies did all 8. But that was confusing because we were God and the communists were Satan. But we're doing the same brainwashing techniques. That was a big stepping stone to my exiting. But what the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back in my brain, and I was a leader, so I was like a fanatic. I would have, he would have said, take this assault rifle and go to Times Square on New Year's Eve and shoot as many people as you can. I wouldn't have doubted it. I would have just done it. That's what horrifies me. In any case, the thing that woke me up was something you just talked about, which is everything that I believed was based on one presupposition, that Moon was the greatest man in human history, that he was doing God's will on earth, that he knew better what needed to happen than anyone else, and that if I just blindly followed, everything would be fine. And once I realized Moon was a liar, and the way I realized that was they handed me one of his speeches published by the cult to congressmen and senators and said, what do you think, Steve? They didn't tell me Moon is a liar. They said, read this and tell me what you think. And I read it, and he was lying to congressmen and senators. And I knew because I had heard him personally 100 times say how stupid Americans were and how the Koreans were the master race. And that doubt, that first thought, oh, he's a liar. As soon as I got that to consciousness, I went, well, wait a minute. If he's a liar, that means he's not trustworthy. If he's a liar, that means he can't be God's agent, because the Moonies teach that God is a God of truth. As soon as I could undercut that one thing, the whole thing was like a house of cards going plop, 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 plop. And then I'm like, what the hell have I been doing for the last 2.5 years? Oh, my God. And I felt horrible.
Yeah, and that's part of. I did have kind of a similar experience, just in that part of what was happening with Larry. So to kind of close the loop on, he'd accuse us of scratching things, breaking things, and then would say, he'd convince you did it, or he'd pressure you to admit you did it, or he'd torture you until you just said you did it so that it would stop. And then he would let you know that this thing was worth thousands of dollars, and how are you going to pay him back? Right. And then you get deeper and deeper in the hole.
Well, he was eliciting guilt, shame,
right.
And guilt manipulation. Absolutely. Right. Go ahead. Keep going.
And then later on, he was doing sort of domain name scamming. I don't really need to go. He was just buying up domain names, making these sort of scam websites, and we were working on that. And so when growing up, my dad, his business was just designing websites for businesses. And so I just have some knowledge of how that works. And I was watching, it feels so silly now, but I was just watching this guy make these terrible websites, the kind of website you land on when you like misspell Google or something. And he was claiming they were like the greatest websites and we were going to make all this amazing stuff. And I just knew he was wrong. Right. And this is such a small thing, but there was this discord where that felt strange. And I knew it. I knew he was wrong, but I had to just kind of go along with it. And then if we're talking about straws that broke the camel's back, for me, one of them was this moment when he was physically abusing me. He had tied essentially a rope around my testicles and was tightening it, and this was in front of my friends. He was trying to get me to admit to some offense. And I think that there was a moment of disassociation. I remember a kind of out-of-body experience.
Pain
my memory of it is... Yes, absolutely. I remember when I think back on this, I see it from above, out of my body. Yeah. I remember not feeling the pain, and that being confusing. Because he claimed to be incredibly good at torture, essentially. Yeah. And so it's like, why doesn't this hurt? That's confusing. It feels like I'm participating.
Yeah, you were
in a
dissociated. I work with trafficking victims, and they report that regularly. And you were not in your real identity. You were in your cult identity.
Totally.
That's another way of saying it.
That makes sense. And so what it still interests me in retrospect, from that sort of removed place, it felt as if I was thinking very clearly. And what I thought was, if he's right, and he, as he claims, always knows what we're thinking, what is true and what is false. So if he's right and he knows what's real, what's fake, what we're thinking at all times, what's true and what's false, then a really easy way to just test this is if I just really convincingly make something up. Because this whole time he's been putting the onus on me to prove that I did or didn't do something he's claiming. So I just thought, I'll make up a story about my childhood that I know for sure isn't true. And so I did. I told this whole story that, the reason that I had sabotaged him was because of this thing that had happened in childhood where I found a baby bird in the driveway and I had, wanted to take care of it, but instead, kind of impulsively, because that was the whole thing that he said, we do things impulsively without our control. I crushed this baby bird. And this is, storytelling is kind of my trade. It worked, right? And he went along with it and was so proud of me for having this revelation and, this, I had arrived at this deep buried memory, and look at, what he had done to draw it out. And so I thought, there's only two options here, which is either he doesn't know that this isn't true, which would mean that he doesn't know all the things he claimed, or he's participating in this performance because it props up his power, which would also mean that he's a liar. So it kind of, that really helped me understand, if you just try out telling a lie on purpose to this person, because at that point I'm going to get hurt either way, so it kind of doesn't matter.
I do that really all the time, actually, with clients who are in these guru cults where the leader claims to be God. They know everything. And, I meet some representative and I play along, and I make up a whole past, completely different than my own, but tell it very believably. And they're like, yeah, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, yep, gotcha. And then the other thing is I've worked with some people who were claiming that the guru was raping them in their bed, even though they had left the cult decades earlier, and were so afraid that because they were programmed to think they had spiritual powers and would come and harm them, then I would sometimes just go, okay, Sai Baba, F you. If you're hearing me now, toast me. Like right now, you got the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, everyone's going to know you ain't nothing. This is just BS phobia indoctrination. And people are like, no, don't do that. And I'm like, trust me, I'm not worried. But these types of, reality testing techniques, and they're always more powerful if the person thinks of it themselves, as you demonstrated you did. So kudos to you. So I wanted to circle back. I remember in your book you talked about your father at one point saying, I think you're in a cult. Like, talk a little bit about that episode, how Larry reacted and the effect on you.
Yeah, so very early on, I had been pulled into this group. Of course, from within, just saw it as a group of friends who were kind of doing something special. And Larry was so great. And I quickly picked up it, in a way that almost felt social, the way you learn, kind of how to be cool. It was like, the thing to say here is to talk about how great Larry is, because everyone's just talking about how great Larry is.
Sure.
And it also began to be clear that if you weren't really outwardly projecting your support of Larry, then you were working against him. And I really didn't want to be working against him. So, when my parents called me, and I had already felt at that point the pressure from Larry to kind of separate from family, that he was talking and getting me to talk about how my parents had, messed with my head in childhood and all these things. It was just the beginning of this.
Right.
And I was surprised that he had encouraged me to, he's like, pick up the phone, right? He like wanted these conversations to happen. And I talked to my dad and was making sure to really be talking about, Larry's so great. He's helping all of us. He's been, here's how he's been helping my friend Claudia and talking through, she had these kind of issues, and he's really just really trying to prove it so that my parents would leave me alone.
Yeah, he was doing damage control, using you to do.
Right. Right. Exactly. And just to keep everyone unconcerned. Right.
Right.
But my dad, because it sounded like I was inculcated and was just sort of towing a party line, said, Dan, it sounds like you're in a cult. And he said it almost half jokingly. At least that's how I heard it. And I immediately, these alarm bells went off in my head. Or it was like, if Larry knows that my dad said this, that I heard it, then he's going to punish me. I didn't have a logical explanation for that. I just was like, I know this is bad. Yeah. And so I ended the conversation and tried to keep this under wraps. And then shortly after, I think whether or not Larry could see that I, was stressed, or he was just arbitrarily, interrogating someone, because that's what he always did. Right. I became the subject of a hot seat interrogation in front of my friends.
Yeah.
And then ended up revealing that my dad had called this a cult. And that became a conversation about, brainwashing. And Larry was pretty explicit, where he said, I don't know why brainwashing gets such a bad rap, because that's what I'm doing. Like, all of you have dirty brains. Like, your brains are messed up and you're all twisted and they need washing. I'm putting your
Moon
brain
said
through the car wash.
exactly the same thing when he was accused
Wow.
of brainwash. He's like, you Americans have dirty brains. You should thank me. I do heavenly brainwashing. And we were like, yes, Father, brainwash us.
Right.
Yes, Father. It's so pathetically stereotypical, but we had another parallel.
I mean, it's kind of amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that this is one of the things we take for granted, I think, being on the other side of this, how foreign the concept of brainwashing seems to a lot of people. And I think it's a part of the importance of this work is a little bit making that comprehensible. I think people imagine like zombies or something, right? Or like, you have swirling hypnotized eyes. And, I want people to be able to understand what it's like to be your regular self and yet to be experiencing all these different pressures, and to in order to protect yourself, you buy in, right? Or you something happens. I think people experience it to different degrees. But it's
people think that you have to have robes or a shaved head. I had a 3-piece suit. I lectured on Fifth Avenue opposite the public library to recruit people. And I was an effective recruiter because I was a true believer. I really believed that we were going to save the world because the world was so messed up and there was no obvious solution to the mess we were in. And what would be a better story than God would send the perfect man and we would have peace on earth and the climate change would get better and everything else. Of course, that was 50 years ago. And look at us now. So you also said in your book towards the end that you went to a therapist, a counselor, and she didn't know what you were talking about. And that's what I've heard for decades over and over. People are like, I went to a therapist. They thought I was crazy. Or, I had to spend all my sessions explaining to them what a cult is. And I'm so frustrated because therapists should know by now. I actually did an online course now on my website so that there's no excuse anymore for therapists to say, I don't know anything about working with cult members. People can say, take this course. It's 9 hours. If you want to work with me and be ethical about it, learn the basics.
Yeah, I think that's great and so important because it's scary enough if you, as in my experience, you exit what is essentially a therapy cult and then you're facing the idea of going to therapy and it's really terrifying. The environment itself is triggering, right? And then in my experience, I went to a therapist. I was still young. I didn't even know how like health insurance worked, all these things. It was so overwhelming. And yet, I had talked a little bit to the person I was dating about some of the physical violence. I was starting to think of it as a cult. I had looked at Lifton's criteria as well and found it really helpful. And so I went to this therapist to did this sort of the Q&A kind of or whatever the packet. And in my first conversation with her, I decided what I need to do is tell her everything so that she has the basics of what I went through and then we can sort of move forward. And I started to try to tell her and had what I would later come to understand as, a full trauma response. It was my throat closing up, my whole body shaking, and, it's like sweating and just feeling like I was going to cry and so hard to talk. But as I started to push through telling her some of these things, I was watching her face and seeing her jaw literally drop in this look of horror, and she just couldn't to be fair, initially, I think she was trying to see if she needed to report this. She was asking if anyone was under 18, that kind of thing, which all is fine. But seemed mostly just incredulous and was trying to understand, why didn't I leave earlier? All of these things that were pretty
which
painful
makes
questions.
people feel guilty, like I
Mhm.
should have left earlier, according to this person. I do want to just
Totally.
say, the number one long-term problem of former mind control victims is trust. How do I
Mhm.
trust anybody else, and how do I trust myself?
Yeah.
And to
Big time.
understand that happened to the younger you were doing the best you could with the information and experiences you had at the time. But if you
Mhm.
do your homework and you understand what to look out for, what questions to ask, how to reality test, um,
Mhm.
you learn that people need to demonstrate trustworthiness for you to trust them. And that
Mhm.
licensed therapists are going to be much more trustworthy than some coach or somebody who has a hypnosis certificate from a 1 week workshop online.
Mhm.
Like, don't go to those people. Please go to a trained ethical therapist. And now there are a bunch of us who are former
Mhm.
members who become mental health professionals. And we not understand from the inside, not exactly your experience, but man, we're going to empower you to
Mhm.
reclaim your mind and your body
Yeah, which is
and
great.
and go to a positive future because
Mhm.
and I would say a universal with people coming out of mind control cults also is that you're programmed never to say bad things against the leader or the
Yeah.
group. So when you're trying to tell your story, there's a part of your programming that's kicking off going, don't tell anybody. What if Larry
Mhm.
finds out? Or what if father finds out?
Mhm.
Or, there are all these ancestors in the spirit world looking at me right now, and I'm going to go on TV and criticize Moon as a cult leader. Like, are they
Mhm.
going to be angry at me for eternity? Because that's what I was told. They would hate me
Mhm.
for eternity if I spoke out against the group. But I had to force myself to be grounded of no, Chinese communist brainwashing is bad. This is what they were doing. I know who I am. I have a loving family. I'm a smart person. I've done my homework. And here's the
Mhm.
truth.
Totally. Yeah, I
You
think
know?
for me, I reached a point where I felt as if I was willing to die rather than be there. And so, there's a kind of power in saying, well, if I was willing to die, then I kind of can do anything. And so why don't I just leave? Because actually the worst thing isn't if I say bad things about Larry and then he shows up around the corner and
Mm.
hurts me. The worst thing is if he brings me back. Like I just don't want to go
Mm.
back.
Mm.
Um, and I would say also just to the point about sort of the value of a professional therapist or psychiatrist, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
is I just didn't know about boundaries. Like I wasn't raised with
Mm.
the idea of boundaries.
Mm.
And I think that one of the huge values of a professional situation is that there are built-in boundaries. And
Yep.
Larry was someone who basically said, I'll be your therapist. And I found the idea of therapy scary. So he didn't say that explicitly, but that was the role
Right.
he was filling. And
Right.
also, come live in my apartment. Just don't
Right.
live in your therapist's apartment.
It's so funny. Today, I belong to a forensic think tank, Dan, at Harvard Medical
Mhm.
School, and my mentor and the co-founder of it, Thomas Gutal, was literally teaching about boundaries
Mm.
for psychiatrists and psychologists. You shouldn't even hug. You shouldn't take a gift. You shouldn't,
Mhm.
meet for lunch. You need to have context and
Mhm.
understand that there are boards that will hold you accountable if you violate any of these boundaries. So
Mhm.
it makes it not that licensed therapists can't abuse them, but ultimately they can be held accountable, lose their license, and be shamed. Um, but at least you know what the boundaries are. And I will plug, I did a blog and an interview on therapy abuse,
Mm.
psychologist abuse, coaches abuse on my website with a therapist with a list of checklists. I'm going to invite you and others
Oh, great.
who are listening to check this off. because in the future you want to know what are the healthy boundaries and what to
Yeah,
avoid. It's great.
absolutely. I find it to be an unbelievably useful way of thinking about relationships and a way to establish trust. You
Yeah.
can work within that framework.
So Daniel Barban Levin, author of
Mhm.
Slonim Woods 9, and I think at the end of the book you said that the name came
Mhm.
from. Tell us the that story that you.
Well, part of what I was trying to get at in the end of the book is that Larry preyed on how small our world can feel sometimes. And,
Mm,
anytime there's a coincidence, you bring in a little magical thinking, and
right,
it's because of him or he, the
right.
interconnections. And the dorm where I met Larry Ray it was in a set of buildings called Slonim. There's Slonim Woods. It was number 9.
Mm-hmm.
So Slonim Woods 9. And it was sort of an odd name that I never questioned. And then in the process of writing this book, I had a family member who was trying to sort out family history. I had a huge amount of my family died in the Holocaust.
Mm,
But we came from Belarus, and she had narrowed it down to more or less this region where there is a town called Slonim. So it's
uh,
just this odd coincidence where, my family most likely experienced some kind of subjugation in Slonim. And then
yep.
here I am generations later in Slonim meeting this kind of fascist like leader who I would
Yeah. And
join.
I'm
Yeah.
Jewish too, and that I
Mm-hmm.
was educated about the Holocaust, and yet I was programmed to believe that the Jews needed to die in the Holocaust because they didn't accept Jesus. And people are like,
Wow.
"You were Jewish. You went to Yad Vashem. How could you believe that crap?" I said, "Because I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, and my behavior was controlled, my information, my thoughts and emotions, and they redid my identity in the image of Sun Myung Moon. So the real
Mm-hmm.
Stephen didn't have access and power to express what I knew was wrong until I got out."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, ah, how dare you do this to me? And when I see all the anti-Semitism rising up, neo-Nazis protesting in the street and such, I just realize, we need to do this work and educate people. And for you can get people out of the Nazis. They are a cult. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's they're not mystical, and they're not magical, and honestly, they're programmed. And the
Mm-hmm.
good news is people wake up. So, Daniel, thank you so much. You're going to get the last words to our listeners. Anything else that
Oh,
you want
wow.
to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing that I want to say is that the experience that I depict in my book is just trying to relay the experience of going from not believing myself and trusting someone else more than me to believing myself. And so I
Mm,
hope that anyone who has gone through an experience like this feels not alone, because they're not. And
yes.
also anyone who is maybe actively going through it is able more and more to feel like they can trust what they're feeling.
Perfect. That's so great. And share your story if you're ready to. And
Mm-hmm.
if you left the relationship or the group years ago, put it in a closet and never dealt with it, good time to bring it out because you're not
Yes.
alone. And it might help
Yes.
America and the planet understand what's happening all over because we're in information warfare where people are being indoctrinated into these mindsets.
Mhm.
So thank you. I hope to meet you in person one day. And thank
I
you
hope so
for
too.
the Hulu series is going to be a case study for future generations of therapists, I predict, if I
Mm-hmm.
have anything to do with it. I know another former member who was a Columbia Medical School graduate on her way to become a psychiatrist, Felicia Rosario, very much wants to use her experience with the Lawrence Ray cult to educate others. And the Hulu series, check it out as well as pick up Slonim Woods 9. Daniel Barban Levin. Thank you.
Thank you so much.